Some people claim that they read the Bible literally. But what does that mean? And is it even possible? We'll discuss these questions today on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are going to look at the whole matter of what it means to read the Bible literally, and the extent to which it can be used. Now, I'm going to say this straight up the bat, which is that there is going to be a lot of moving parts to today's video. The fact is that this is a complicated subject. It might seem that to read something literally is pretty straightforward, but the fact is that the English language has changed a lot over the last 50, 100 years. And as a result, we're dealing with a lot of new definitions of what it means to read something literally or say something literally. Things are going to get deep here, even though what we're talking about is how to read stuff essentially in English. So with that, let's get into this. Now, today's question rose because of a debate I heard last week between Taylor Professor of Theology Randall Rouser and a self-labeled fundamentalist debating over the reading of Exodus 32. Now, Rouser said you cannot read Exodus 32 literally because it would make God appear to change his mind. The fundamentalist responded that just acknowledging the incident happened satisfied a literal reading. The fundamentalist also further added the claim that when he sends a letter or email to his family, that he always speaks literally. So that sort of sets the parameters of today's discussion. Now, I'm not going to evaluate Rouser's claims or what was exchanged in the debate because that exchange is not really relevant to today's topic. However, what is relevant is the claims of the fundamentalist. And he makes two claims that are very important to evaluate. The first is that understanding an event that was recorded as actually happening is the same as reading the passage literally. And the second claim is that he always speaks literally. So those are the claims that we need to evaluate. But let's start by providing a definition for what we mean by literal. Now, as is often the case, people go to dictionaries. And while they aren't that helpful as we're going to see, they do provide us with a bit of a starting point. So let's consult two dictionaries here. The first we'll consult is the Oxford English Dictionary that uses the definition of literal as, quote, taking words in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or allegory, end quote. Okay. That's a very basic definition, doesn't give us a whole lot, but it's basic. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary states, quote, adhering to fact or to ordinary construction or primary meaning of a term or expression, end quote. Okay, so now we've got two conflicting definitions, and we'll explain later how these definitions are sort of different. But they do seem to have minimally two requirements. One, that to read something literally, you must use the words of a term or expression. The other requirement is that the words have to be taken in their most usual or basic sense, without any other literary device. However, like a lot of dictionary exegesis, this really doesn't solve anything. Because, ironically, the problem is, how literally are we taking the definition of literal? For example, D.A. Carson, in his book Exegetical Fallacies, outlines 4 different meanings for the word is, all of which adhere to fact, but not all are literal. So, in a sense, each one of these definitions of the word is would satisfy the literalness of the Merriam-Webster definition, but not necessarily satisfy the definition of the Oxford definition. So what's going on here? How can this be? How can you have 2 definitions of literal with different meanings? Well, like most words in English, the word literal actually has multiple meanings. There are at least 3 different meanings for the word literal. And this might sound kind of strange, but there is a literal meaning, an associative literal meaning, and an ironic literal meaning. Now, when Bible interpreters and exegetes talk about reading something literally, they mean reading the words in an ordinary sense, or what is often called the wooden literal meaning. This is a literal meaning of literal. So, that's what people often think about when they think about the word literal. There is also an associative meaning, which Merriam-Webster includes, which is that words give the overall impression of corresponding to fact. For example, the guitar was literally art. In this meaning, the words are not being read in a wooden literal way, but the overall passage is comparative with what is true so as to associate the content with being literal. Finally, there is the ironic meaning. Now, this comes out of a misuse out of the word literal. It's sort of an inversion. Kind of like, it's so hot it's cool. And this happens in English from time to time, where words get inverted with their opposite meaning. And this is just a normal feature of everyday natural language. In this particular case, with the ironic meaning, the speaker will say something literally for emphasis to express what is actually a figurative meaning. For example, it is literally raining cats and dogs. Now, cats and dogs are not literally falling out of the sky and hitting the pavement. That would be ugly and messy. But it's basically a use of emphasis, using literally as a kind of emphasis to express something figuratively. And that's probably that's probably the most recent of the 3 meanings. But it does come out of a misuse, and it is now considered to be generally accepted standard English. Now, the exchange between Rausser and the fundamentalist, Rausser uses the literal meaning of literal. However, the fundamentalist switches between both the literal and associative senses of literal without realizing it. And in the process, he commits the fallacy of equivocation, which is using the same word in two different senses. And this can happen fairly frequently and actually without you noticing sometimes. Moreover, the fundamentalist said that he read the entire chapter of Exodus 32, and by only claiming that the events happened, that this is sufficient for a literal reading. The problem is that this is not an actual literal reading of the words. We would expect that he is reading each verse of the chapter literally and then making his analysis based upon that literal reading. But that's not what's happening here. There is a layer of interpretation that is not being acknowledged. The fundamentalist has confused a historical interpretation with literal reading because he has switched to an associative sense of the term literal. Now, it's this associate sense that most biblical exegetes would reject, because it lacks the precision to make the definition useful. If you could take a chapter of the Bible and you could say, okay, yeah, it's got some poetry in there, it's got some allegory, it's got metaphor, it's got idioms, and then you said you're reading all that literally, it dilutes the meaning of literal. You're not actually reading that chapter literally, even if you say the whole thing is actually true. The associate meaning of literal doesn't have any use for a biblical exegete. It's not precise enough. It's very vague. And because it's very vague, it's vague to the point where all sorts of literary devices can be used and still be called literal? That's just not going to work in a discipline as precise as biblical interpretation. But this raises problems for, say, a literal reading of Exodus 32:14. Now, that particular verse reads, quote, Yahweh was sorry about the harm he said he would do to his people, end quote. The issue here is that, and this is what Rausser was really trying to raise, was that a plain or ordinary reading, that is, the wooden literal reading of this passage, would suggest that God experienced regret and changed what he said he would do. So, what Rausser was trying to suggest is if you read this passage literally, what ends up happening is God changes his mind. And he was trying to point out to the fundamentalist that if you commit to ideological literalism, that you end up with God changing his mind. Well, the fundamentalist answered that God had always intended to relent from the beginning, essentially sidestepping the objection. But in sidestepping the objection, he is not actually doing a literal reading of Exodus 32:14. But instead, he is providing an interpretation of the overall passage in contrast or in opposition to the plain sense. And he appeals to a definition of literal that is different to the definition of literal that Rausser is using. In philosophy, we call this sort of argumentation moving the goalpost. You don't like where the objector is placing the objection? Well, you change it. You change the goalpost so that it's easier to score the goal. Well, the fundamentalist here has changed the goalpost by changing the definition of what it means to read something literally. From the literal reading, or the wooden literal reading, to the associative literal meaning, where the overall passage just has to be true in order for it to be literal. So there's some shenanigans going on here. But this is also the ultimate problem with ideological literalism, which is there's always the need to rely on ad hoc explanations to sort of get you out of trouble when the interpretive method doesn't quite work. The problem is the interpretive method of ideological literalism doesn't abide by its own premises. There's a saying in philosophy, that a usefulness of philosophy is, can its own rules apply to itself? Well, in this particular case, the rules that it sets out doesn't always apply to itself. It needs rescuing. And that rescuing comes by ad hoc explanations. Now, we have to ask the question, why does ideological literalism fall into the problem where it needs to rely on ad hoc methods? And the reason comes down to, say, the virtuosity of human language. Now, no human language, and by that I mean like a naturally developed language on this planet. I'm not talking about artificial languages, but natural human language. Almost all the natural human languages on this planet cannot be read as purely literal languages. Human language is natural language that contains a wide diversity of linguistic and literary devices. And these devices go well beyond the literal. There's an amazing array of literary and linguistic devices that are part of natural human language, and Hebrew is no exception to this. Reading the biblical texts literally doesn't work because it strips the original inspired author of his virtuosity and replaces it instead with an ideology. And that ideology is no more based in linguistics and language than racial purity is based upon genetics. So then, if the fundamentalist is not reading the text in a literal or wooden literal manner, what about his second claim, that he is always writing literally? Because he said, when I write my emails to my parents or letters to his parents, that he always writes in a literal fashion. Well, we've already seen that he uses both literal and associate meanings for the same word. So, in a sense, he's already refuted himself. But we can also say that this is false for another reason, which is that American English is highly idiomatic. Our language is full of multiple meanings, metaphors, idioms, and non-literal expressions from sports, gambling, drinking, the military, and even media. These expressions are inescapable in our language. And practically every other language contains them as well. One of the problems with being a native speaker is that we use these non-literal expressions invisibly. And in many cases, we're actually blind to them. In fact, I've just used one without you even knowing it. They demonstrate that no language can be read entirely according to the literal sense of literal without somehow distorting the message of the natural language. Now, when we get to, say, biblical exegesis, it's because of natural language. We have to use a more nuanced method for interpretation, which is why we use the grammatical-historical method instead of ideological literalism. When we use the grammatical-historical method, what we are doing is we are basically taking the text, analyzing the grammar, determining the genre, finding its historical context, applying natural language to the proper sense of the meaning. So now, when we encounter a passage like Exodus 32, we can see that the passage is a teaching, didactic passage. And when we start reading it, this becomes very evident. The passage starts out with the golden calf scene. Okay? Moses goes up the mountain and God says, hey, they have violated the covenant. I'm really, really angry and I'm going to strike them all dead because of my vengeance. And Moses says to God, no, don't do that. Otherwise the Egyptians will see that you broke your promises and they'll make fun of you. Have mercy on the people. And God relents. But then Moses goes down and he sees what the people have done and his anger is enraged. And he lets loose his anger upon the people. People die. There's a contrast in this passage. The contrast here is God staying his vengeance, choosing the path of mercy, while Moses lets his anger run completely out of control. So when we read a passage like Exodus 32:14, where it says God is sorry, this is a hyperbole, basically an amplification to show the nature of Yahweh as the kind of God whose nature it is to choose mercy over vengeance. If we were to believe and take this passage, this text, this one verse literally, it would suggest that God changes his mind. But in its context, in its genre, in its literary composition, what we see here is there's a contrast here between what God does and what path God chooses and what man chooses. So what we get here is the fact that the hyperbole of Exodus 32:14 is that God is merciful. And his mercy is greater than man's. What we get out of this, though, is that while this passage cannot be read literally, it is undoubtedly true. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you'll learn something. And I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.